Imagine that you are rolling an enormous boulder up a hill. You can feel the weight of it against your chest as you slowly win over its bulk, edging it millimeter by millimeter up the slope. Your legs ache and your back screams in torment, and just at the moment where you reach the top, the boulder slips from your grasp and comes crashing back down. You see it far off in the distance and begin your descent, knowing that you'll have to do this over and over again for all eternity, without break nor respite. Can you be happy? The phrase "imagine Sisyphus happy" has become almost a bit of a meme. You can find it on t-shirts and coffee mugs and in the Twitter bios of edgy teenagers. The line comes from Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, one of the most famous works of existential philosophy ever written. So today, we're going to go through this book, chapter by chapter, in detail, to try to answer the question, how can Sisyphus be happy? Or, to put it another way, if life is pointless, what does that mean for how we live it? Back in February, I ran a reading group on this very text, and this video is the result both of the articles I wrote for that group and our collaborative discussions. Before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out to two books that were incredibly helpful in writing this video. The first is John Foley's Albert Camus, From the Absurd to Revolt, and the other is Olivier Todd's magnificent biography of Camus. Any corrections will be in the pinned comment, and let's get started. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Life is absurd. What now? The distinctive aspect of Camus' philosophy, at least according to Camus himself, is that he begins where many other philosophers and writers and thinkers end. It's not uncommon to see someone come to the grand conclusion in their work that life has no transcendent meaning, or that we're alone in the universe without a god or a heaven or some other realm, and that this should in some way cause a seismic shift in our whole attitude to life. This was, in fact, a theme in much of the literature of the 19th century, where stories would sometimes end with the primary protagonist realizing that life was pointless. And if we zoom forward to the early 20th century, well, under a certain interpretation of many of Kafka's novels, the protagonists of those stories also gradually realized that life and the universe are absurd and meaningless, as represented through a rather tortured bureaucracy or an uncaring family dynamic. In his History of Nihilism in the 19th century, John Stewart touches upon many, many great works where arguably the main point is to hammer it into the reader's head that life is pointless. And this makes sense. It was quite a novel idea to bring to the forefront of culture at the time. So what sets Camus apart from this group of thinkers? Well, he is, by and large, not that interested in demonstrating to the reader that life is, in fact, meaningless. Instead, he explicitly takes that as read. In his words, the absurd, hitherto taken as a conclusion, is considered in this essay as a starting point. Camus already thinks that life is meaningless, and he's largely just concerned with working out how we should react to that meaninglessness. And Camus thinks that this question really matters because he wants to know whether we can even bear to live in full consciousness of this absurd situation. He declares this in a now very famous line. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. The use of fundamental here is quite important. It's fundamental in the sense of first. Before we answer any other philosophical question, we first need to settle the matter of whether life is even worth continuing or whether we should throw in the towel, so to speak. And the reason for that is fairly intuitive. If the answer to Camus' question is no, then every other question becomes kind of moot. We could rephrase Camus' question as asking whether, if life is meaningless, we ought to condemn it. So, again, the Myth of Sisyphus is not aiming to demonstrate that life is meaningless, it's instead examining the conditional of whether that meaninglessness is a vote against life. The key term around which Camus' entire absurdist philosophy revolves is, unsurprisingly, the absurd. We've already heard it once. This is a really important term to clarify because it's very natural to take it to just mean that life is meaningless. And in fact, especially in some of his later works, Camus does use the term the absurd in this way. But specifically within the context of the Myth of Sisyphus, that is not the whole story. If life were meaningless, but that didn't matter to us very much, then there wouldn't be an existential challenge to solve. The actual problem of meaninglessness comes from the conflicts between life's seeming meaninglessness and our deep-rooted desire for transcendent meaning. By meaning here, I take Camus to mean something like a predefined purpose, or what Jean-Paul Sartre sometimes calls an essence. That is, some goal that we were designed for. This idea of a purpose, or a telos, is a very ancient and important one in philosophy. To use an example from Aristotle, the telos of a knife is to cut things, and that's why we call a sharp knife a good knife. Now, imagine that we definitely knew that there was a god who designed humanity with a particular telos in mind, say to love one another. Well then, following this ancient Aristotelian logic, we would then have a way to know exactly what it means to be a good human, what it takes to fulfill our purpose. Today, even in non-religious circles, we still do have the idea that an underlying purpose is quite important. That still floats around the zeitgeist. Consider how many self-help books are about finding your true purpose, or how we talk about dying feeling fulfilled. That is purposive language. Although in our secular age we speak far less about having a purpose handed to us from God, we still yearn for this transcendent telos, right? This is the kind of yearning that Camus thinks defines the absurd. We want our transcendent higher meaning or purpose that we can find out there in the universe, but the universe is silent in the face of our pleas. It does not provide a telos for us. Something else that Camus talks about here, which is, I think, quite often ignored in conversations around the myth of Sisyphus, is that another aspect to the absurd, one that he doesn't necessarily revisit that much, but I think is important, is a lack of access that humanity has to anything beyond the world of appearances. That is, we never understand the world on its own terms, but are trapped within our own human perspective. Even the 3D image of my sight is just an amalgamation of two 2D images that my brain is combining through some process I don't understand to help me navigate the world. For Camus, this too is a problem. It's a sort of epistemic dimension to the absurd, because we yearn for knowledge about how the world actually is, but we're stuck merely with how the world appears to human beings. So even at the level of perception, the transcendent world, if such a thing were to exist, is cut off from us. As Camus puts it, I don't know whether this world has a meaning that transcends it, but I know that I do not know that meaning, and that it is impossible for me just now to know it. What can a meaning outside my condition mean to me? I can understand only in human terms. This quote neatly ties together the two strands of the absurd for Camus. Not only is the world deprived of some transcendent purpose or meaning, it is also robbed of depth beyond appearance. Now, obviously, Camus doesn't think this necessarily presents a problem for us in our everyday life at every single moment. Most of the time, we continue to live and go about our regular business simply out of habit. But there are times, say the death of a loved one or a midlife crisis, when we can suddenly become aware of the absurd in a way that we simply cannot avoid. It stares us in the face and confronts us with the idea that everything we've done and everything we will do will all ultimately be for nothing. For Camus, this revelation actually happened quite early in life. When Camus was just 17, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a disease that, in his context, was essentially telling him you will die young and painfully while your lungs fill up with fluid and you suffocate. It's pretty grim. Camus himself came from a dirt-poor family in French Algeria, and the first successful cure of tuberculosis using antibiotics wouldn't occur for another 14 years. Camus only survived this because he had access to free medical treatment, which was a privilege that was afforded to him specifically because his father died fighting for France in the First World War. It's very easy to look at the myth of Sisyphus and think that it must be the product of someone who hasn't really suffered and so can spend all day reflecting on the significance of life and death and meaning in a merely idle sense. But in fact, the direct opposite of this is true. Camus grew up in deep poverty, and he would formulate many of his initial thoughts for the myth of Sisyphus while this quite awful disease was rotting his lungs from the inside. This book is decidedly not the product of a man thinking about death just from behind the safe walls of a manor house. It's written by someone who has suffered from extreme poverty and incurable illness from a really quite young age. Of course, it may be that this moment of realization may never come to us, but Camus is clear that even in this case, the absurd remains a problem, because it would then imply that Were we ever to have a realization and see the world more clearly, we would then conclude that life is not worth living. If we can't find some way to reconcile ourselves with the absurd, then the conclusion that Camus would draw is that life is only worth living in ignorance. There are some thinkers who've toyed with this idea. Émile Cioran is perhaps the most well-known of them, but Camus just wouldn't be satisfied with this. He wants to see the meaninglessness of reality clearly, and yet, in some sense, not let it touch him. As he puts it, knowing whether or not one can live without appeal is all that interests me. I do not want to get out of my depth. This aspect of life being given me, can I adapt myself to it? This is the importance of Camus' challenge. It is nothing less than asking if we can accept the world as it is, and yet not take that as an argument against life. But let's revisit that moment of existential crisis, the point at which someone becomes acutely and unavoidably aware of the absurd. How do humans, in fact, tend to respond to this? Well, Camus thinks there are a variety of options on the table. The first, and maybe the simplest, is just to stop living. For Camus, this is totally unacceptable. It's tantamount to admitting defeat against the absurd. He just simply will not have that. At the very least, and I've said this before, as a philosophy of life, this leaves quite a lot wanting. The second is to give up lucidity and give up awareness in something that Camus calls, and God forbid me, because I'm about to curtail my speech for censors, philosophical unaliving. You can guess the word. That is, he thinks that we retreat into some idea of transcendent meaning and purpose for life that, according to Camus, isn't actually there, but it provides us with what we need to make peace with the world. It is leaping into an illusion. As an atheist, this is ultimately how Camus saw religious existentialists like Soren Kierkegaard and Lev Shestov. It's tempting here to think that Camus is like an anti-theist of some variety, but in fact, he himself admires these thinkers deeply. We know, for example, that even though he was an atheist, he continued to recommend Shestov's incredibly and unavoidably Christian writings throughout the 1930s to many of his friends. He has no moral objection to taking this path. He explicitly calls it legitimate, but he himself is dissatisfied with it because he just doesn't think that these leaps of faith are leaping into anything true. Thus, for him, they abandon the principle that, for a man who does not cheat, what he believes to be true must determine his actions. In other words, it doesn't really answer his question of whether we can live without appeal. Camus also puts in this camp those who comfort themselves by pointing to a higher realm that isn't religious in nature, like Plato and, more controversially, Husserl. We're not going to get into that, but that's how Camus interprets Husserl's philosophy. Camus also sees this as presenting a vision of reality that is existentially comforting, but ultimately abandoning the truth. If we have a higher realm, by posit, we could still potentially justify ourselves by reference to it. This is how Plato uses the form of the good to ground ethics. We could, in theory, use these realms to talk about transcendent meaning or transcendent goodness, and we can use them to add depth to the world in terms of something beyond it. This is in fact similar to the critique that Nietzsche levelled at Plato, that Plato posited a higher world beyond that of appearance. Thus, these worldviews unjustly deny the absurd. Of course, this isn't how Platonists would see things, but my point is that is Camus' argument. So what are we left with at this point in the essay? Well, we're left with the bare bones of what will become Camus' early absurdism. The idea that we must live in full awareness and full consciousness of life's meaninglessness and of the absurd without giving in to despair and deciding that life is not worth living. But what does this actually look like? 2. Absurdism. Opening principles. The Myth of Sisyphus isn't structured like your standard argumentative essay. Instead of giving a neat definition of what absurdism is, Camus chooses to sort of slowly unfurl his characterization over the course of the essay, which eventually culminates in the figure of Sisyphus. And while that is certainly a very dramatic image, and we'll be talking about it in quite a lot of detail later in the video, we can only make sense of it in its full grandeur by appreciating everything that leads up to it. Sisyphus hogs all the attention, but there's far more to absurdism than just the phrase, "imagine Sisyphus happy." The first clue we get as to what absurdism will look like happens really quite early on in the essay, during the discussion of religion. Carrying this absurd logic to its conclusion, I must admit, that struggle implies a total absence of hope, which has nothing to do with despair, a continual rejection, which must not be confused with renunciation, and a conscious dissatisfaction, which must not be compared to immature unrest. The absurd has meaning only insofar as it is not agreed to. This is a pretty bare-bones characterization, but it also contains within it many of the major themes that Camus will develop in the rest of his essay. Absurdism, at this point, abandons hope, rejects the transcendent, and accepts a kind of underlying dissatisfaction regarding this lack of transcendence. However, at the same time, it rejects despair, renunciation, and mere restlessness. The idea that the absurdist, in some sense, does not agree to or rebels against the absurd is also going to be quite important. As we shall see, Camus' early absurdism consists of almost living in spite of the supposed despair that the absurd is meant to cause in us. It is thus a kind of revolt or rebellion, although rebellion will become a more major theme in Camus' later work. Firstly, I want to contrast this with the kind of flattened version of absurdism you often encounter, that it's the mere idea that we must create our own meaning. In fact, what sets the writings of Camus apart from so many of the other philosophers of this period, especially early Camus, is that he ostensibly rejects the idea of meaning creation. This is something that he will lean more heavily on, especially in some of his speeches post the publication of the Myth of Sisyphus. But at this point, Camus doesn't talk that much about creating meaning at all. The absurdist doesn't just recognize there is no grand meaning to the universe and then posit a grand meaning for himself. The absurdist must, in Camus' view, keep their awareness of the world's meaninglessness in their mind at all times, and also keep their own unsatisfied inner longing for meaning in mind at all times as well. They're meant to do all of this while at the same time believing that life is still lived all the better if it has no meaning. It's a pretty tall order. This is also where we encounter another major difference between how Camus is sometimes presented and what he actually writes in his early work. It's very easy to present absurdism as a kind of calm, unbothered philosophy, with the absurdist resembling a sort of ancient sage. And importantly, there are elements of this characterization that are true, and we'll come on to some of those later. But at the same time, it is a philosophy that is consciously lived in rebellion against the state of the universe. And to that extent, I think that we ought to characterize it as active and energetic, and not at all resigned to serenity, if that makes sense. And the first property of the absurdist that Camus chooses to discuss in detail is their absurd freedom. And I think this is really key to both understanding the appeal of absurdism and also some of the ways that Camus himself was dissatisfied with it, and how he saw it as coming up short in some of his later works. As he puts it, "Now, if the absurd cancels all my chances of eternal freedom, it restores and magnifies, on the other hand, my freedom of action. That privation of hope and future means an increase in man's availability." At one level, I think this is a really intuitive point. If mankind is not made for anything, then doesn't that increase the scope of what we can do? If we don't have a predefined purpose or telos that is undeniably and transcendently good for us to follow, like obeying the will of an omnibenevolent God, then we're no longer bound by a transcendent code. I think this is what Camus means when he sometimes talks about absurdism involving a sort of release of pressure. Our existence no longer carries the weight of eternal life or of being part of some eternal plan for creation. It is temporary and fleeting, and that can be really quite freeing from a certain point of view. I mean, we talk about the dangers of meaninglessness, but surely there's also a corresponding danger of having too much meaning. My favorite literary example of this is Satan in Paradise Lost, who at all times has to carry the weight of his eternal damnation with him. And you can see the disastrous effect this wreaks on his psyche. It is not at all clear to me that this is a better situation than having to accept meaninglessness and transient mortality. The word Camus uses to describe this state of realizing freedom is innocence, the sense that there is nothing better, in a grand cosmic sense, that the absurdist could be doing. There isn't the same guilt that someone might feel that they're not living up to their so-called purpose, be that serving God or a particular societal role. This freedom is expressed in Camus' claim that absurdism values the quantity of life over the quality. What he means by this is that more life lived in full awareness of the absurd is better than less life lived with that awareness, but that regarding outcomes other than this, the absurdist must remain indifferent. They must concede that every life lived in awareness of the absurd is equivalent to every other life lived in awareness of the absurd, and the only thing that matters is the awareness of the absurd and the time spent in that awareness. This idea might immediately spark worries, and I think Camus is alive to those worries. How can the absurdist be indifferent to the quality of life? Won't that lead to total amorality and a license to do as much harm as we want to other people because it doesn't really matter? Camus himself is well aware of this problem. In the next chapter, he mentions his concerns about this principle of innocent freedom and tries to counter them. The absurd does not liberate, it binds. It does not authorize all actions. Everything is permitted does not mean that nothing is forbidden. The absurd merely confers an equivalence on the consequences of those actions. It does not recommend crime, for this would be childish, but it restores to remorse its futility. Okay, I'm going to put my cards on the table. I've had a really good go at trying to steelman this position, but I just think it's quite a weak argument. It is quite unclear how certain things are forbidden under this form of absurdism. And although it's true that it doesn't recommend crime, the fact that it does see all consequences as equivalent, I think that just is what people are concerned about when they talk about the dangers of absurdist indifference and absurdist freedom. Camus doesn't really develop this line of argument in The Myth of Sisyphus, and interestingly, if I were to hazard a guess, I think that's because he himself is unsure what to make of this seemingly quite repugnant conclusion in his own philosophy. This ambivalence is, I think, pretty evident in the two fictional works that Camus was writing at the same time as this essay, and they were originally going to be published as a trilogy to just kind of illustrate how connected they are. The two works in question are The Stranger and Caligula. And both of these works feature absurd heroes who use their absurdism as a license to kill or otherwise harm others. This is most extreme in Caligula, which follows a sort of fictionalized version of the Roman emperor who has an existential crisis and then decides that if life has no meaning and no value, then he can kill whoever he wants and it doesn't really matter. In the end, he is killed by another absurd hero named Cheria, who says that although he does agree with Caligula's reasoning to a certain extent, he cannot let him live. But the justification for not being able to let him live, it leaves a lot to be desired. He's not basing it on anything, he's just acting. And this, to me, seems tantamount to Camus acknowledging that his early work can't solve this problem of absurdism licensing murder. And it's also clear to me that Camus wouldn't be satisfied with a philosophy that licenses murder, considering that at this point he has already spent years campaigning for various political causes and takes a notably moralistic line in much of his journalism and his essays. Camus himself has a strongly held morality, and that seems to conflict with the license that absurdism brings. This also comes across in The Stranger, which follows somebody who does kill a relatively innocent person and displays no remorse for it at all. And while that's not necessarily dwelled on in the novel, I do think that that still illustrates this open challenge for Camus' early philosophy. Now, you might think this isn't really a problem for early absurdism. It's definitely not an internal problem, if that makes sense. If life is meaningless, well, why should we expect there to be hard limits on our actions that are kind of dictated by the philosophy? At the very least, it's just clear that Camus himself saw this as a problem. John Foley charts the development of this dissatisfaction in his book. Particularly, Camus writes a series of pieces called Letters to a German Friend, which are fictional letters written by a fictional Frenchman to his fictional German friend, who is an ardent Nazi. And in these letters, you can see that Camus is searching for a reason to say that the Nazis are wrong without violating his prior absurdist principles. This attempt to reconcile the two halves of Camus' own outlook on life will eventually culminate in Camus' later works, like The Plague and The Rebel, where he tackles the question of violence and amorality under absurdism head-on. We don't have time to talk about that much today, but one interesting feature of The Rebel is that it explicitly treats Camus' early absurdism as a form of methodical doubt, like Descartes' method in the First Meditation. And this seems to imply that, much like that first meditation is a prelude to Descartes' more constructive philosophy, this early work is also a skeptical prelude to Camus' constructive philosophy that might be found in his later works. At least that's one way of reconciling the two halves of Camus' career here. We're not going to go too much into that today. We'll mention it a little bit at the end, but I want to keep this video primarily focused on the Myth of Sisyphus. But I wanted to bring up this critique of absurdism because it's very easy to treat the Myth of Sisyphus as if it is the completed and total form of Camus' philosophy, when in many ways it is an early work that he himself would take issue with later in life. And this particular criticism about everything being permitted seems to be the driving force behind that later development. As we can see, however, this is already a far richer and more radical philosophy than just the idea that life has no meaning but that shouldn't get us down. But Camus is certainly not done characterizing absurdism yet. Alongside this underlying innocence that forms the general framework for the rest of his essay, he outlines a few characters that are seemingly intended to help us make sense of the kind of psychological attitude the absurdist might have. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. 3. Meet the absurd men. It's quite difficult to talk about the position of the elusive absurd man in Camus' philosophy. On the one hand, he emphasizes that the examples he gives of absurd men in this chapter are not meant for us to just emulate unthinkingly, and that even the concept of the absurd man isn't meant to be a goal, certainly not a transcendent goal. However, the absurd men are also clear examples of figures that Camus thinks are uncontroversially living an absurdist life. And we get a level of detail in their presentation that we don't get elsewhere. So even though they're not meant to be ideals, they are basically indispensable if we want to get a handle on what this thing called absurdism is when we get down to the nuts and bolts level, which is ostensibly the purpose of this video. Firstly, something that's often overlooked in discussions about the absurd man is that the initial example Camus cites of someone with kind of a roughly absurdist attitude is the German polymath Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and specifically his claim that my field is time. It's unclear whether Camus thought that Goethe himself was something like an absurd man, which would be really interesting given that I've always thought Goethe was a pantheist, or whether it's just this isolated quote that's meant to be emblematic of the attitude of the absurd man. What I suspect that Camus is trying to draw out here with that particular quotation is the immanence and earthiness of Goethe's life philosophy, with the focus ostensibly being on this existence, the stuff in time, rather than things that went beyond it. Of course, another philosopher we know who deeply admired Goethe and also had a big influence on Camus is Friedrich Nietzsche, who also describes Goethe as a convinced realist and opposes him to those who venerate the ideal or the unreal. So it may be that Camus is pointing to this refusal to venerate the unreal, because that will end up being a key characteristic of the absurd men. Camus says that absurd men live in full consciousness of the absurd, but they seem to do this in various different ways, which can present a challenge to any simple interpretation of the Myth of Sisyphus. We will look at each example that Camus gives in turn, and then try to see how together they give us a rich picture of absurdism. As we'll see, each of them present truly quite radical ways of living, and I think that can be helpful to hammer home just how demanding absurdism can be as a philosophy. The first example of an absurd man, or the first fleshed out one, excluding that quote by Goethe, is Don Juan. Of course, there is a straightforward way in which Don Juan plunges into his transient life and values that transience because he devotes himself to the gratification of his sexual desires above all else. He is earthy in an almost vulgar sense. However, Camus pointedly doesn't focus on that aspect of his life in the chapter. He instead focuses on his jovial outlook more generally. The laugh, the conquering insolence, that playfulness and love of theatre are all clear and joyous. Melancholy people have two reasons for being so. They don't know or they hope. Don Juan knows and does not hope. It is quite false to try to see in Don Juan a man brought up on Ecclesiastes, for nothing is vanity to him except the hope of another life. This connection between giving up hope and general gaiety and attitude is, in my view, the most illustrative part of Don Juan for making sense of Camus' philosophy. Don Juan seems to view life as something akin to a game, and can adopt a sort of two-level consciousness that we often have when we are playing a game. In this mode of engagement, we both really do care about the game at a kind of first-order level, but at a second-order or a higher level, we recognize that the game ultimately doesn't matter. When I play chess with a friend and inevitably lose because I'm awful at chess, I really do care about the game while it's going on, and I earnestly try to win. But when I do lose, it just doesn't trouble me. I can laugh and then get on with my day. This, I think, is the attitude that Don Juan, as an absurd man, can adopt towards life as a whole. This is how nothing in life is vanity to him, but at the same time he doesn't have hope or transcendent meaning. It's worth noting that Camus says when others condemn him, Don Juan does not condemn their condemnation, he accepts this as explicitly the rules of the game. Interestingly, Camus' version of Don Juan ends his life in a monastery, lost in contemplation, rather than continuing his rakish ways until death, which is, I think, illustrative of quite an important point that Camus will emphasize at the end of his chapter, which is that while the absurd men do live pretty extreme lives, absurdism and the absurdist attitude can be present in almost any life. The next absurd man is called the actor, and he sort of does what he says on the tin. He is a devoted theatre performer committed to his craft. There are two further aspects of absurdist philosophy that I think are brought to the fore by the character of the actor. The first is a taste for the ephemeral, and thus no particular desire for eternity or eternal life. And the second is the freedom to play with his character and identity, in the actor's case, because he's playing with his characters on stage. So, firstly, the actor must take up a character that is not real and then make them real for the 2 to 3 hours where they inhabit that particular role. Thus, not only must they be adept at that twin consciousness that we talked about with Don Juan, they must also be perfectly content with taking great pleasure in something that lasts a tiny amount of time, even within the brief framework of a human life. When the actor becomes immersed in Hamlet, despite the fact that Hamlet is not real and can only exist for the time he's playing him, they are denying the implicit value proposition at the heart of many religious afterlives, which is that true value can only be found in the eternal. The actor can value things that aren't only transient in a cosmic sense, but transient in a very human sense. On the other hand, the freedom of the actor is summed up in this line. He abundantly illustrates every month or every day that so suggestive truth that there is no frontier between what a man wants to be and what he is. Always concerned with better representing, he demonstrates to what a degree appearing creates being. That is, being able to put on and take off so many faces and skins, the actor learns not to concern themselves with whether or not they really are one thing or the other. They stop being constrained by an overarching idea of personal identity and recognize that they are free to change who they are at any time simply by changing what they do. Again, the extremities of absurd freedom are revealed here. The actor is liberated in his ability to take joy and value in the transient, even the transient identities that he adopts. And similar to Don Juan, the actor very much lives in time, in the sense that they too reject any notion of the eternal. The actor shares the twin consciousness of Don Juan. Don Juan views his life as a kind of game that is taken seriously at this first-order level, but seen as pointless from a second-order one. And the actor, in effect, thinks the same thing about all their myriad roles. When they do take to the stage to bring up the character of Hamlet, they find it in themselves to care about the play, even though it is short-lived, mortal, and ephemeral, and they know all of this throughout. In both cases, there is lucid immersion in a reality that is explicitly recognized as, in some sense, not true or meaningless. And this, I think, is a really helpful framework for understanding the absurdist attitude to life. It's something that we're definitely going to come back to when we look at the magnificent figure of Sisyphus. Finally, we have the conqueror, who delivers a grand speech to the reader. True, this is a person who has reportedly conquered land, and presumably enacted great suffering to do so. Yet, in his monologue, the conqueror specifically doesn't focus on this aspect of his history. Instead, he talks about how he overcame himself. This is how he describes his general, shall we say, existential state. Every man has felt himself to be the equal of a god at certain moments. At least, this is the way it is expressed. But this comes from the fact that, in a flash, he felt the amazing grandeur of the human mind. The conquerors are merely those among men who are conscious enough of their strength to be sure of living constantly on those heights and fully aware of that grandeur. So, the key point to the conqueror's worldview is that he has a sort of veneration for the human mind and for human life, with all of its limits and, importantly, all its mortality. The conqueror treats the human as a concept with the same attitude that has hitherto been reserved for the transcendent. The conqueror tells us, quite significantly, that he has a taste for lost causes, by which I take him to mean a simultaneous acceptance for and rebellion against man's quest for something immortal and unchanging. The conqueror's monologue is quite cryptic. At one time, he both seems to recognize the tragic state of humanity, but at the same time, he himself rejoices in that state, because he considers goods all the better because they are transitory. And this is a quality that he most obviously shares with the actor, but also shares with Don Juan's attitude towards his love affairs. Taken together, these absurd men, these illustrative characters in Camus' work, can be a little bit confusing. They're quite different from one another, and their actions and lifestyles are really quite disparate. However, the main thing they do have in common is this underlying consciousness of their absurd condition, an awareness that their life is transient and aimless, and a recognition that this does frustrate one of mankind's dearest aims. But as they have each abandoned any hope of something beyond this, they've learnt to rejoice in the life that they actually have to hand. In this sense, they do keep the absurd condition of their existence at the forefront of their minds at all times, while, importantly, not letting it crush them. And we've already explored some of the implications this has for the way that they approach existence. And when I reflect on this strange dynamic, I try to bring it down to earth with an example. I imagine that many of you have, at some point or another, had an unrequited crush on someone. One of the things that's so frustrating about this situation is that our minds tend to twist anything our beloved does to encourage and inflame our meager hope that they might feel the same way about us as we do about them. But rather than help things, this essentially hope keeps us in deep uncertainty and makes us more likely to despair. Wouldn't it be better if one day we had a definite sign that they absolutely did not feel that way for us at all? Then we would, sure, be deprived of hope, but we could also take stock of our situation and live from that standpoint. And, as I say, that's kind of a trivial example, but I think that this is what Camus' absurd men are doing, but writ existential. The abandonment of any hope for grand transcendent meaning and to satisfy that inner longing is, in a sense, a bitter disappointment to them. But once they do recognize this, there's no positive reason to despair. They just have to dust themselves off and bear in mind at all times that they are in the condition of the absurd. When they do just have only this life before them, they can give it their full and undivided attention, albeit in the strange way that the absurd implies. Camus ends this chapter by reiterating that the point of these examples was not the particular first-order things that they did, but their general attitude towards life and towards those first-order desires. In theory, anyone could be an absurd man in any physical condition of life, so long as they could recognize at all times that life had no meaning to it, and that it is fleeting and transitory, while not allowing this to make them despair, nor to retreat into some kind of eternal hope. And at this point in the book, it's easy to think that many of us must, in some sense, already be absurd men. After all, if you personally are not religious and have abandoned any hope of a transcendent meaning, then it's tempting to think that you've already fulfilled Camus' conditions. And to this, I would just point out a couple of things. The first is that we must remember the initial condition of absurdism that we looked at in the last chapter, valuing the quantity of life over the quality of life. This is such an extreme and radical demand that I doubt many people can truly live up to it. But the second is that Camus is not done characterizing absurdism yet. He has 2 more chapters to go, and each of them bring their own complications and richness to his overall philosophy. 4. Absurd creation and plague. Since we often refer to Camus as a philosopher, it's easy to forget that he probably considered himself primarily a novelist and a playwright, and thus a form of artist. So it's no surprise then that the act of creation itself forms a pretty significant part of how he conceives of absurdism. He even calls the absurd creator the most absurd character in the work. So it is clearly important to understanding the overall philosophy at play here. I will say before we begin this section that, at least in my view, this is by far the most cryptic chapter in the book, and there are so many themes and strings to it that I'll have to skim over a fair amount of it for just the sake of brevity. We'll be here all day otherwise. So I'll largely restrict myself to covering what I see as the key points from this chapter that are relevant to absurdism as a lived philosophy. So, immediately, Camus tells us what absurd creation cannot be. Absurd creating can't be creating to find a refuge from the absurd. After all, if this were true, then all the philosophers and theologians he looked at earlier who came up with complex and often quite ingenious philosophical systems, in Camus' opinion, to run from life's meaninglessness, would then count as absurd creators, and this simply won't do. It would kind of trivialize absurdism. So, at the very least, we have a clear idea of what absurd creation is not. Camus also clarifies that, above all, what the absurd men were doing in his last chapter is a form of creating. There's a very interesting line that illuminates this. Creating is living doubly. The groping, anxious quest of a Proust, his meticulous collecting of flowers, of wallpapers, and of anxieties, signifies nothing else. At the same time, it has no more significance than the continual and imperceptible creation in which the actor, the conqueror, and all absurd men indulge every day of their lives. All try their hands at miming, at repeating, and at recreating the reality that is theirs. This, like a lot of passages in the chapter, is kind of obscure, but if we look at it closely, I think that it really expands upon something that we touched on in the last section, but can properly flesh out here. What the absurd man does, for Camus at least, is a kind of lucid pretense. We saw this with Don Juan, who could take the enemies he made and the condemnations he received with a light attitude because they were simply the rules of the game he was playing. But here, we get confirmation that this attitude is definitional of absurdism as a whole, and of absurd creation in particular. They treat life as a kind of pantomime. And as we said before, this would involve seeing reality at two distinct levels. At one level, we have our desires and our wishes, which are the equivalent of the game Don Juan is playing or the actor's stage. And at this level, we genuinely do desire things. We strive to accomplish them much like we would in an ordinary game or when we are inhabiting a character on stage. We take on the attributes of the person we're performing. However, at a meta level, we recognize that these desires carry no real weight and don't matter all that much. The act of absurd creation, that is broadly construed, not just in the realm of art, is to be able to plunge wholeheartedly into this first-order pretense without losing sight of the second-order lucidity. At first, this can be quite difficult to get your head around, but this two-level structure that we keep coming back to is arguably something that we find in a great many philosophies of life, both in this period and well before it. For example, in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, he encourages himself to play the role that has been assigned to him as emperor and fulfill all the duties that that entails, while at the same time, at a higher level, recognizing that what really matters is stoic virtue, and the actual duties themselves are, to a certain extent, immaterial. Another example might be in the ancient skeptical school, where at one level they would act and do things in the world, while at another they would recognize that nothing is certain, and that the knowledge they supposedly act upon on a day-to-day basis, that is, isn't properly knowledge at all. This would allow them to attain an ataraxic measure of peace while still engaging at some level with reality around them. In all these cases, the two-level structure is important because it permits someone to engage with the world around them while at the same time distancing themselves from it in some sense. But to go back to absurdism, what this two-level structure does for the absurdist, in particular, is that it allows them to adopt what I would term a playful attitude towards life. I think this is something that many people instinctively feel when they first encounter absurdism. The absurdist seems like they wouldn't take life too seriously. They would be able to endure the vicissitudes of existence pretty lightly because they wouldn't assign much significance to events that ordinary people would call highly negative. It's like when you're really stressed about something, but then you suddenly realize that it doesn't matter much either way, and so you stop being stressed. The absurdist sort of takes this attitude towards life itself. It's no coincidence that when we talk about absurdist authors and playwrights after Camus, like Samuel Beckett, these are often people who take a very playful attitude in much of their work. They poke gentle fun at the conventions and mores that get ordinary people like myself so het up in life. And they point out how silly they are when viewed from this absurd, grand perspective. But let's think a little bit about what this playfulness actually consists of. Drawing on the work of Maria Lugones, the philosopher C.T. Nguyen argues that playfulness is the ability to pick up and put down different sets of rules and roles quickly and easily. This is easiest to conceptualize if we think about young children. When my cousin, who's about 10 years younger than me, was a very small child, she would quickly swap between imagining that she was a princess or an astronaut, or Dora the Explorer was always a favorite, seemingly with very little trouble or mental friction on her part. Like many of us when we were younger, she had a naturally playful attitude towards life. She didn't take any of these roles particularly seriously. She knew that they weren't significant, but that didn't stop her from enjoying them even a little bit. Likewise, the effect of both creating something while recognizing that it's all pointless is that anything that you create would be held lightly and playfully. The absurdist would be able to pick up and put down first-order roles and desires with the same ease that my little cousin did, or at least that's how I interpret Camus here. But there is a worry that you might have with this. One of the standard things that people tend to want from their concept of meaning, or whatever they substitute in for meaning, is a stable direction to their lives. A kind of enduring North Star that, even if it's not eternal, is at the very least lasting and enduring. But this seems like it's the very thing that the extreme playfulness of the absurd man and absurd creation would not provide. Camus himself at this point might not see this as a criticism. After all, this instability might just be the inevitable result of no longer having an eternal external anchor in your worldview, of living without appeal. However, I do think this explains why at least some people come away from the Myth of Sisyphus deeply unsatisfied with its answers. If what you desire is some kind of clear, reliable stability to the orientation of your life and your first-order aims, then it's unclear that absurdism fulfills that need or is even particularly interested in fulfilling that need. There's nothing in Camus' philosophy here that will prevent someone from embarking on a quest 1 minute and then abandoning it the next and doing something entirely different. This fluidity is definitely part of what makes absurdism quite attractive. It's what lends it its playful air. But it does come with downsides as well. We'll be returning to this idea of playfulness and second-order orientations when we discuss the figure of Sisyphus, so, put a pin in that. I also think that there is a danger here that becoming too playful is to give in to a kind of extreme ironism, such that straightforward, earnest engagement with the world, where you are just fully immersed in it at a first and a second-order level, becomes kind of impossible. The absurdist always has to keep in mind at any given moment that it's all pointless. And I don't know, you might have a worry there that is too ironist of a position for your tastes. Again, I don't really think Camus would see this as a critique, but I think that it's worth mentioning here because it's something that people would often bring up in the comments or in the live discussion around the Myth of Sisyphus, this worry about irony. However, Camus also does specifically discuss artistic creation in this section, and in doing so, I think he brings forward just how difficult it is to be an absurdist once again. For Camus, the absurd creator is quite analogous to the absurd man in that while creating, they must keep the pointlessness of their creation in their full awareness at all times. And yet, Camus places special emphasis on artistic creation as an activity because he thinks that it is particularly difficult to spend time creating something while being fully aware that the objects of creation do not really matter. And by being aware here, I don't just mean in the mere cognitive sense, that is, paying lip service to meaninglessness or just affirming the abstract proposition that life is meaningless. I mean to actually feel the pointlessness deep down in your bones while you're creating something. I mean, this is incredibly difficult. I've been experimenting with this attitude myself, and I do find it almost impossible to actively be writing a video or a blog post and at the same time to truly feel like it's meaningless, to have that idea fixed in my head while I'm expending effort and attention on the writing. You might even question whether this idea is even coherent. Isn't the expenditure of effort in this focus-directed way just a demonstration that something is meaningful to you? This, I think, is a very important question, especially if you take a more dispositional definition of what makes something meaningful. So, what would a truly absurdist artwork look like for Camus? We do get some ideas. He says it must remain aware of its gratuitousness and so not amount to positing a meaning for life or for itself. It can't arouse hope in the reader and so on. This is why Dostoevsky falls short of writing an absurdist novel in Camus' eyes. We might turn to The Stranger as an illustrative example of an absurd novel, but personally, when I was reading this chapter, the image that kept occurring in my mind is those elaborate sand drawings that certain Buddhist monastics construct only to immediately brush them away again. To expend such extraordinary levels of effort and care on something that you know isn't just transient but is like almost momentary seems to sum up the kind of attitude that Camus talks about here, that of performing two tasks simultaneously, negating on the one hand and magnifying on the other. Another key implication of this two-level attitude that we keep coming back to is that it is very process-focused. In order to create while at the same time considering your own creation meaningless, the only reason that you could possibly be doing it would be for the act of creation itself. That is, for the process of undergoing and expending the effort, rather than the specific outcome the effort is geared towards. We'll examine this in more detail when we talk about Sisyphus, because it's obviously relevant to that image. But I wanted to bring it up here because I think it illustrates another aspect of abandoning all transcendent or final meaning in your philosophy. Things can't be pursued in service to some ultimate end, since no ultimate end exists. They can only really be pursued for the experience of pursuit. For the absurdist, and especially the absurd creator, the goal can't be to have the completed artwork. It's got to be to undergo the process of creating the artwork. And if we reflect on the initial absurd premise, this sort of seems obvious. Deprived of any final or ultimate end, the absurdist only has means. The only thing they can fully embrace as a goal is the experience of living itself. That's sort of the only thing they're left with. It's difficult to see at first, as Camus doesn't spell it out for the reader, but much of what he says in this section is just a very expanded and complex version of the initial observations he made about absurdism all the way back at the beginning of the book. I think that's one of the reasons why the structure of the Myth of Sisyphus is, it at first seems like it's disorganized, but then once you've been wrestling with it for a while, it actually comes across as really very organized and quite beautiful. To bring these two ideas of absurd man and absurd creator together, we can conceive of the absurd man as a kind of artist, using life as their artwork, in full knowledge both of life's transience and its meaninglessness. This, again, means that the Myth of Sisyphus is not a philosophy of passive acceptance. Instead, it almost becomes an injunction to quite a great and terrible task. To live as an absurdist is to take up the daunting job of making your life a playful, light-footed work of art without forgetting how pointless this artwork would be. You might call that self-contradictory, and perhaps it is, but I think that it's what Camus thinks it takes to live without retreating into an illusion, either consciously or unconsciously, at least at this early stage in his philosophy. There's also a sense in which these observations, if we take a slightly broader view, reflect back onto Camus himself, especially when we talk about his later writings. In many ways, Camus' later work is an attempt to recreate a kind of solidarity between all mankind in the face of, the sufferings of the world, even though there's no transcendent reason to do so. And in this sense, we could sort of characterize him as an atheistic counterpoint to Dostoevsky, eventually trying to demonstrate with all his might that though there be no God and even no meaning, it doesn't follow that everything is permitted. It's not clear whether he ever totally succeeds on this point, even by the end of his life, and yet he keeps going at it, aware that even if he succeeds, this won't matter all that much anyway. If we view the incredibly impassioned writings of Camus within his own premises, then I think we find that he is a great example of absurd creation and the absurd creator. That is, provided that he himself never unconsciously took a leap of faith and returned to transcendence. And depending on how you view his later work, you might think that actually he did do this. But now, let's move on to the most famous image in the essay, that of Sisyphus rolling his boulder, and examine exactly why this becomes the picture of absurdism for early Camus. 5. Imagining Sisyphus happy. In many ways, I like to think of the Myth of Sisyphus as structured like a certain kind of musical symphony or orchestral piece. In the first section, the key themes are introduced, the kind of base layer is laid, and then in later sections they are developed, they're played with. Further thematic elements are brought in which build on what's come before, and in some cases, challenge or nuance is deliberately added. But finally, we're brought to a grand finale, which in this case, I would argue, is the story of Sisyphus. And this takes all of the material that's been laid down in the previous 80 or so pages and combines it into one big, quite shocking crescendo. It's the moment where we take the most absurd fate imaginable, that of Sisyphus, and use Camus' absurdist philosophy to try and make it bearable. However, a great many presentations of this chapter just skip to the end. They get right to the boulder and to eternal damnation and all of that good stuff. But Camus doesn't just deal with Sisyphus post-punishment. Sisyphus's entire life is also seen as an example of absurd heroism. The tale of Sisyphus's earthly existence famously involves him fooling death in a myriad ways and thumbing his nose at the gods in the process. In one version of the story, he chains up Thanatos, who is the Greek god of death, which means that no one can die until Thanatos is released. In another version of the tale, he asks his wife to discard his body into the streets after he dies, and he uses this pitiful sight to persuade Hades, the god of the underworld, to let him roam the earth temporarily to ensure that he gets a proper burial. Of course, once he's topside, he has absolutely no intention of returning to Hades, and he lives out a full life in rebellion of both the gods of death and of the dead, and also just, the designs of eternity in general. In this way, even Sisyphus in life is almost the perfect image of the absurdist. He spits in the face of transcendence and chooses instead to cling fast to the transient and ephemeral human existence instead. Again, we see that the absurd hero is not a figure of resignation. You could not characterize Sisyphus as resigned. He is instead a figure of loving life to an aggressive degree. The tale of Sisyphus also brings out the absurdists' total aversion towards death. Since they adore life so much that they consider even its pointlessness to be no objection to it, they will guard it like their greatest treasure. This was touched upon earlier in Camus' essay when he says that for the absurdist, a long-lived person is still better off than someone who dies early. This is, I think, kind of an oddly pedestrian observation to make among a lot of the complex philosophizing of Camus' essay. But I also think that it's really important because this clinging to life allows us to contrast absurdism with many other philosophies that deal with death. Take ancient philosophical schools like Stoicism or Epicureanism. If I'm going to generalize somewhat, both of these philosophies thought, in slightly different ways, that death wasn't really bad for us, and they recommended that we go peacefully into it. But that's not how Sisyphus reacts, nor is it how Camus wants to react. One of the few uncomplicated values, if we can call it that the absurdist is permitted to have, is to desire more life. Accepting death peacefully is pretty much anathema to the absurdist, even though they also recognize that death is inevitable. This is part of what makes the absurdist a kind of hopeless rebel, because what they desire, more of this ephemeral and transient life, is specifically what cannot be granted to them. We can read the tricks that Sisyphus plays on the gods in return for more earthly existence as sort of what the absurdist would do if only they had the opportunity. I think this is just very important because, again, it strikes against that figure of the absurdist as a kind of resigned sage. But anyway, on to the most famous and sexiest part of Camus' book, the analysis of Sisyphus's punishment. Try saying the analysis of Sisyphus's punishment 5 times very quickly to realize how many times I had to record that line. For his crimes against the gods and against death, Sisyphus is condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for all eternity, only to watch it come crashing back down that hill, ready for him to do it all over again. The context of the myth is, I think, very important here, because it is normally, or traditionally, interpreted as representing the sheer foolishness of trying to run from death and of clinging too fast to life. In Homer's telling, the punishment is described as follows. I saw Sisyphus in agonizing torment, trying to roll a huge stone to the top of a hill. He would brace himself and push it towards the summit with both hands, but just as he was about to heave it over the crest, its weight overcame him, and then down again to the plain came bounding that pitiless boulder. This is symbolic of how Sisyphus kept getting tantalizingly close to overcoming death, but was always ultimately overwhelmed by it. Sisyphus's life itself mirrors Sisyphus's punishment. So, by choosing this myth to illustrate a love of life and a life well spent, Camus is pointedly reversing the classic interpretation of the story. Additionally, I want to note that Sisyphus's punishment has a cyclical structure to it, which has, for a very long time, been used as a symbol of the type of situation that would inevitably bring on existential despair. We see this in the book of Ecclesiastes, where a deeply felt nihilism is represented by the end of one day and the beginning of the next one, with nothing new under the sun. When Macbeth says, tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in its petty pace from day to day, that too references a kind of daily cycle that nonetheless isn't going anywhere. Dostoevsky used the image of a man passing water between 2 glasses, arguing that such a fate would send a man insane through its sheer meaninglessness, even though it's not physically unpleasant. We even still use this metaphor today, right? People will often describe a pointless situation as like running on a hamster wheel, or words to that effect. Given his familiarity with Nietzsche, Camus may specifically be thinking of Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return here, which is sometimes called his existential imperative, and which Nietzsche himself often calls his greatest burden. In the passage of The Gay Science, where he outlines this idea, Nietzsche asks us to imagine that a demon comes to us in the night and tells us that we will live just this life over and over again, just as we have, and inevitably just as we will, for all eternity. And then he asks how we would react to this. Would we throw our hands up in despair and curse the name of the demon, or would we rejoice and say that we'd never heard such blessed words? Part of the reason the eternal recurrence is a burden, as well as a potential liberation, is because it implies that nothing we ever do is finished once and for all. All our desires that we thought were fulfilled will one day be opened in the next cycle, and so on and so forth forever. It is the day-night cycle of Ecclesiastes, but writ large. So, when Camus tackles this image, he's engaging with a long and venerable history of cyclical images representing the challenges of a pointless existence. What Camus will do with it, and arguably what Nietzsche also sought to do with it in his works, is to demonstrate that this cycle need not crush us. And Camus chooses specifically to focus on the time when the boulder has come crashing down the hill yet again, and Sisyphus is walking down to the bottom to begin his punishment once again, forever and ever. At first, Camus tells this part of the story with the same tragic, lamenting tone with which it was probably told thousands of years ago. At the very end of his long effort, measured by skyless space and time without depth, the purpose is achieved. Then Sisyphus watches the stone rush down in a few moments towards that lower world, whence he will have to push it up again towards the summit. He goes back down to the plain. It is during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me. A face that toils so close to stones is already stone itself. I see that man going back down with a heavy yet measured step towards the torment of which he will never know the end. That hour, like a breathing space, which returns as surely as his suffering, that is the hour of consciousness. At each of those moments when he leaves the heights and gradually sinks towards the lairs of the gods, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. If this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. Where would his torture be, indeed, if at every step the hope of succeeding upheld him? I just want to take a moment to look at the language here, right? We have time without depth, torment of which he will never know the end. Camus is summoning all of his considerable literary gifts to hammer home the difficulty of Sisyphus's situation. This passage gives us the received and seemingly obvious and unquestionable view that Sisyphus's fate is something tragic and insurmountable. However, it is in the next few paragraphs when Camus begins his absurdist shift and challenges this classic interpretation that Sisyphus must be in a miserable fate. If the descent is thus sometimes performed in sorrow, it can also take place in joy. The word is not too much. Again, I fancy Sisyphus returning towards his rock, and the sorrow was in the beginning, when the images of earth cling too tightly to memory, when the call of happiness becomes too insistent, it happens that melancholy rises in man's heart. This is the rock's victory. This is the rock itself. The boundless grief is too heavy to bear. These are our nights of Gethsemane. But crushing truths perish from being acknowledged. Thus, Oedipus at the outset obeys fate without knowing it. One does not discover the absurd without being tempted to write a manual of happiness. What by such narrow ways? There is but one world, however. Happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. They are inseparable. It would be a mistake to say that happiness necessarily springs from the absurd discovery. It happens as well that the feeling of the absurd springs from happiness. This is the clearest illustration of how absurdism and a kind of existential joy are linked in the whole essay. Firstly, we're told that the thing maintaining Sisyphus' sadness at the start of his punishment is a memory of a transcendent idea. It is the hope for a life that is not available to him and cannot be his fate. It is only when he finally acknowledges the crushing truth that his situation just is inescapable and there is nothing else for him that Sisyphus can be joyful again. We've mentioned both Stoicism and Nietzsche in the video so far, both of which draw upon a notion of amor fati, loving your fate, and this forms key parts of their philosophies. And when we think of imagining Sisyphus happy, I think that we sometimes ignore how much of this has to do with the notion of fate and abandoning hope of anything else. Camus continually re-emphasizes the concept of fate throughout this chapter, and he often links it directly to absurdism. All Sisyphus's silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. His rock is his thing. Likewise, the absurd man, when he contemplates his torment, silences all the idols. It's worth noting here that when Camus first fell ill with tuberculosis, he turned specifically to the work of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus to bring him some comfort. One of Epictetus's main ideas, of course, is learning to not wish that things be otherwise than they are. That is, to love your fate, and sort of to love your fate specifically by abandoning false hope. Thus, when we're attempting to imagine Sisyphus happy, there seem to be a couple of key components that this chapter adds. The first is familiar. It's not hoping for a transcendent other world to redeem us. But the second is much more demanding and much more challenging, and that is to love whatever life has given us, regardless of whether or not it is what we would have initially wanted or hoped for. The abandoning of hope isn't just occurring at this kind of highfalutin philosophical level, but also at the very practical level of not hoping for our lives to be different from whatever they turn out to be. After all, this is the only existence granted to us, and so the only thing to do is to love it. This is what valuing life for its quantity and not its quality seems to mean for Sisyphus, and thus for Camus, at least at this point. There is another curious aspect to the way that Camus tells this myth, which I think mimics what he says earlier about the absurd men. Sisyphus doesn't stop pushing the boulder up the hill, even though he knows it's pointless, and we're not given any indication in this chapter that he couldn't stop. I personally see this as just reiterating the twin consciousness of absurdism. Just because Sisyphus knows that the boulder will never stay at the top of the hill doesn't mean he won't want to push it to the top again. Similarly, the absurd man recognizes that any final goal he might have for peace or permanent joy is pointless. But that won't stop them from pursuing their first-order desires. They'll just have to do so with the same ironic detachment that Sisyphus does, in full certainty that those desires will not bring them final reconciliation. You could draw a kind of comparison with Schopenhauer here, but we just don't have time. Likewise, Sisyphus's boulder pushing is itself, I would argue, an example of absurd creation. In his attitude towards the punishment, Sisyphus raises his life to the level of an artwork, and we can see each individual journey up the hill as sort of akin to how the absurd creator views their creations. Each time Sisyphus pushes this boulder up, he is mimicking the absurd creator who embarks on a creative endeavor, and as the boulder falls back down, it is a reminder of the ephemeral nature of each and every creation, that it doesn't really matter. Not that Sisyphus takes this as an argument against continuing to roll the boulder, quite the contrary. Sisyphus already knew the ephemerality of his task and saw it as no argument against its completion. I think this is how we can tie the image of Sisyphus all the way back through the entirety of the text. That's what I kind of meant when I described it as a crescendo, as a culmination of these themes. And it's worth noting that Camus himself relates the fate of Sisyphus to the fate of the ordinary person, and especially the workman. The final line of the Myth of Sisyphus, again, I think complicates more simplistic readings of Camus, including those that I have fallen into in the past, and I just want to look at it in detail now. Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. At first, this passage can seem like it contradicts the idea that Camus gives earlier in the essay about specifically being aware of life's meaninglessness. The fact that Sisyphus feels like the universe is neither sterile nor futile seems eerily close to taking a leap of faith and conjuring up a meaning for the world in precisely the way that Camus forbade earlier in the essay. But instead, I see this rejection of futility not as crafting a meaning for the world, but instead as rejecting meaninglessness as an argument for life being sterile and futile. The fact that it is Sisyphus doing this just pushes this argument to its most extreme. Sisyphus has fully embraced his lack of hope and doesn't long for any state other than the one available to him. In the sort of isolated micro-world of his own eternal punishment, he finds everything that he needs. The fact that Camus also takes the time to highlight that the struggle is what fills Sisyphus's heart is also very important. After all, while we might think that life doesn't need a meaning, that is so much easier to say when we ourselves are not experiencing deep suffering or struggle. This was part of Nietzsche's explanation for the dominance of Christianity and the ascetic ideal. It was partly an outgrowth of people needing to make sense of suffering, alongside all of the other factors like ressentiment. By making Sisyphus his representative of absurdism, Camus emphasizes the difficulty of living without appeal. It is not just a matter of saying, I guess life is meaningless, and moving on with our lives. It is maintaining that joyful, playful, lucid, absurdist stance, even in situations of great pain. And we can recall from earlier in the video, Camus was very familiar with situations of great pain. However, at this point, you might wonder whether Camus actually has given us a framework within which to deal with the suffering of Sisyphus. If we ask why Sisyphus is happy, I see two main components. One, Sisyphus has accepted that there is no transcendent meaning and given up hope for any reality other than the one in front of him. Two, he refuses to take this as an argument against existence, but manages to find pleasure and joy in the struggle towards ephemeral satisfaction in full knowledge that the struggle will begin again. But I think a fair question to ask here is what kind of person could truly achieve this? Who even could imagine Sisyphus happy? Camus himself is pretty much silent on this matter, and I think that it falls to us to answer. One option would be to see the figure of Sisyphus as something that we could approach but never achieve. Another would be to argue that certain individuals could achieve this state, but that it wouldn't be for everyone. Or finally, we could argue that, despite initial appearances, the state of a happy Sisyphus is actually attainable for any one of us. Given Camus' humanist leanings, I suspect he would choose the first or third of these options, but I don't know for certain. The essay seems to leave this open, and I think that it is a fair challenge to Camus' philosophy to ask how realistic this goal is. It also does just seem to be an empirical question. It's not something that I could answer from the armchair. But now that we've gone through the whole essay, let's put it in the context of Camus' overall work and identify some more open questions the essay raises, some of which Camus did actually tackle in his later philosophy. 6. A Tale of Two Camus. As I've mentioned a number of times in this video, the Myth of Sisyphus belongs to Camus' earlier period, and is merely one stage along the philosopher's overall development. Just as there is early Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein, and there's early Nietzsche and mature Nietzsche, we can think of there being an early Camus and a later Camus. And the line that divides them is the period sort of between 1943 and 1945, just after the publication of The Myth of Sisyphus, where Camus is working with the French resistance to fight against German occupation in France. And I don't think that I can put this shift in Camus' thinking better than Olivier Todd does in his biography of Camus. The world no longer seemed absurd, but terrible instead. Revolt was the response that Camus wanted to give in his life and in his chronicle. The absurd man Meursault, as well as the abstract heroes of the Myth of Sisyphus, are overwhelmed by events and by the thoughts of man caught up in the torments of European history. Camus had once toyed with the idea that if God did not exist, everything was permitted, with the double temptation of getting rid of conventional morality and creating a new one. Now, he stated that value judgments cannot be suppressed entirely, for that would deny absurdity. When Camus writes The Plague, and even more so when he writes The Rebel, he doesn't agree with his earlier assertion that someone can follow his philosophy yet live almost any kind of life. Absurdism gradually grows outwards from being about a solitary individual struggle against sheer meaninglessness to one that encompassed all humanity and has just as much to do with resisting injustice and suffering as it does keeping the awareness of the absurd in mind at all times. In the Myth of Sisyphus, the absurd men and Sisyphus himself are said to value life, but in practice, they largely value their own lives. And this goes even more so for Meursault and Caligula, who both ultimately do kill without remorse and display total indifference to the sufferings of others, or at least they nearly do. This just isn't so for Camus' later absurdist protagonists. If anything, the closest we get to a solitary, absurd hero in Camus' later works is Jean-Baptiste Clément's in The Fall, and his inability to honestly and earnestly connect with other people alienates him from the world in a deeply unpleasant way. It's sort of a dark reflection of Meursault's indifferent alienation in The Stranger, but here it is not triumphant in any sense. It comes across as riddled with pathos. This is not a character that the audience can in any way emulate or admire. If Sisyphus was the representative of Camus' early philosophy, and I think that plausibly he is, then his later philosophy is embodied in someone like Ivan Karamazov and his declaration that he couldn't consent to live in utopia if it relied on the suffering of even one innocent child. Or if you want an ancient Greek example for the sake of symmetry, it's in the figure of Prometheus, who rebels against Zeus on behalf of all mankind. Camus calls this later work, The Rebel, a philosophy of limits, and it's aimed precisely at defining where the absurd man's action should stop, in recognition of his solidarity with his fellow man. And thus, gradually, absurdism shifts from being about singular individuals to being about all of humankind, which is then how Camus became known as one of the greatest humanist writers of the mid-20th century. I wanted to emphasize this dissatisfaction that Camus had with his early philosophy, because the way that I see Camus and the Myth of Sisyphus treated online tends to be split into two camps. On the one hand, we have people swearing by the dictum "imagine Sisyphus happy" and hanging off every word the early Camus says. And on the other, I see people writing off his work as ridiculous or beyond consideration. And I think both of these approaches leave something important out. The Myth of Sisyphus is fantastic, but it's like any other philosophical work. There are many things that we can and should learn from it, and I really hope that you've taken a few things over the course of this video. But at the same time, it is certainly not above criticism, and Camus himself criticized it in a variety of ways in his later years. Our approach to Camus doesn't need to be hagiographic. We don't have to transform him into some kind of intellectual saint, and indeed, that would not be in the spirit of these earlier works. At the same time, the Myth of Sisyphus offers us one potential answer to the question, if life is meaningless, then what now? You don't have to accept the answer. I don't think that Camus did eventually, and I certainly don't think that you should accept it uncritically. But I do think that it is worth wrestling with. You might, like later Camus, think that this early version of absurdism just didn't go far enough, that we need something more substantial and first order to build our existential philosophy around. You might, on the other hand, think that the Myth of Sisyphus actually goes too far. After all, whence comes the value of this quantity of love? Why should we expect to actually imagine Sisyphus happy? Why could it not be that life's meaninglessness simply leaves it open for us to do anything, including embracing outright nihilism or leaping into the arms of a religious faith? These are the kind of questions that I think we need to ask if we are to take Camus seriously. I don't think that either transforming Camus into a saint or dismissing him out of hand is doing that. And I hope that, if nothing else, this video has persuaded you to pick up the Myth of Sisyphus and give it a read if you haven't done so already. You might come away from it with a totally different interpretation than I did, and that's absolutely fine. And I also highly recommend that you check out some of Camus' later works, like The Plague and The Rebel, for a very different kind of absurdism, which places far more emphasis on our relationships to other people. And so I will ask again the question that we posed at the beginning of this video. Can we imagine Sisyphus happy? And if so, how? But if you are interested in The Plague and want to hear some of my thoughts on it, then I have a video for you right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.